Welcome to this edition of Excavating the Bible, What Archaeology Can Teach Us. I'm Doug Clark from La Sierra University. I direct the Center for Near Eastern Archaeology. My co-host, Dr. Larry Garrity, also with the Center for Near Eastern Archaeology, longtime administrator at La Sierra, is still on assignment. Our conversation partner, though, Dr. Kent Bramlett, is here, Associate Professor of Archaeology and the History of Antiquity at La Sierra. Also an Associate Director of the Center for Near Eastern Archaeology.
That's right.
We have a great time working together, lots of projects going, some new degree programs that are coming out at the graduate level in archaeology, so lots of fun we're having. We have been working our way through biblical books, and so far we've sort of followed the biblical order, not the chronological, but the biblical order of the books. I would like to change because now we're moving to the writing prophets. Now, before I kind of explain fully why I want to do this, writing prophets, how do they compare with the people at least we don't have any books from? How do they compare?
Well, we think of Elijah and Elisha, I guess, certainly well-known prophets, but they didn't leave any works, written works that we have in the Bible. So the writing prophets are quite different. It begins rather abruptly. I mean, Amos is the first one, about 750, give or take.
Yep.
And from that point on, we actually have the words that were the messages of these individuals. So we have a much fuller understanding, I think, of their message, how they fit into their life and times, and what their concerns were for Israel and Judah.
Sometimes we hear the stories about their lives and background, but not so much as with Elijah, Elisha, Gad, Nathan, and those kinds of prophets and what they did. But we do have the written repository. We do have text. And as you mentioned, this gives us really something to think about and study, and it's part of the biblical text. So the writing prophets, you mentioned that Amos is probably the first, and that is the one we'll be looking at. I thought it would be good to do the prophets a little differently in terms of order than what we've done so far, and approach them chronologically so that we can then have something of a sense of development. We're going to be working, first of all, with the 8th century prophets, the 700s. So we have Amos, Hosea, Isaiah,
Right.
and Micah. So we have those 4. So if we treat those kind of back to back, we might be able to kind of keep thinking in that time period, and who the major players are, local and the empire.
Right, and how it relates to the external enemies.
Exactly. And I think we'll see some resonances between prophets from the same century, especially this is not a big area. These are not people who, one speaking from New York City and the other one from Tokyo. I mean, they're living within a few miles of each other. And so the culture we might be able to get at better, and certainly archaeology is here to help us uncover that. So we're going to do that. So we'll look at Amos, then move to Hosea, and then Isaiah and Micah. And then we'll turn to the 7th century prophets. So this is going to be a little bit different. Before we turn to Amos, a couple of questions, and then we do have some artifacts. Amos, do you like the book of Amos? Okay, I'm going to start with that question. And then I want to ask why, if you do or don't.
I do. His origins, his life is a little bit intriguing. You can imagine here's this farmer or some sort of rancher almost, maybe it includes cattle and farming. But he's got this overpowering message, you know, and he brings this out. He says, I'm not a prophet, or don't call me that, but he is, he has a real message, a real burden. And it's interesting just to try to understand why, what were his concerns, what was going on at the time that made that so important to him. And I think his overall concern is something that is important. We don't want to trivialize his concerns. We'll try to get into the psyche, I guess, the real deep societal concerns that he had. So I do like Amos.
Some people have suggested that the titles for Amos might actually lead us to conclude that he wasn't just a farmer, but maybe a sheep breeder, and therefore a businessman who, if that's so, is at least moving toward one of these kind of upper echelon, at least higher income. We don't have a middle class. So we've got the poor, and then we've got the merchants, and get up to royalty and so on. So if he is, okay, just if he is, and then he speaks for the poor, this is an interesting kind of voice. If we look, well, when we look at the prophet Micah, he is poor. He is one of the poor. So here's a voice emerging from poverty. Amos's voice is very much the same on behalf of the poor, but it may not emerge from poverty.
Right, he's not a shepherd, he's a noked or a boker, owner of flocks of sheep and goats and probably herds of cattle. So that's why I would say maybe a rancher would connect with some of those implications.
So you're thinking about Amos and his message, which really does have to do with how we treat people, how we treat other people. So social justice, I think people have used that term to describe it. When we turn our attention in the next episode to Hosea, is he going to be concerned about that or something else?
He's got a different concern. But it's interesting, it's also a primary, well, maybe we're getting ahead of the story, but it's one of two major themes that Jesus picks up on. You know, right worship of God and the right treatment of our fellow human beings. So I think they pair very nicely together. And to look at them one week after the other, I think provides a framework for then following through the prophetic message through the later prophets.
I think that's right. One can even think about the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments. The first four dealing with worship, how is it that you worship God? And then part of the fourth one, because there's social justice in the Sabbath commandment, especially the Deuteronomy version of it. But then the rest of them, the rest of the commandments, how do you treat your fellow human being? So that sort of dichotomy shows up there, certainly in the prophets. And I think if we'll just watch to see, there will be overlap. They'll talk about both. But Amos is so strong on social justice. Hosea is so strong on how you relate to God that we ought to take these as two basic thrusts of the prophets. People may be intimidated by prophetic literature. And people, sometimes will put lots of future connotations into it. That's fine. The prophet did talk about the future. But they were much more concerned about how you were related to God on the one hand and how you related to your fellow human being. So this dichotomy is, I think, an interesting one, and the prophets are going to show us a lot about it. So we have some artifacts. We'll move from conceptual to the very physical,
the concrete,
in front of us, to the tactile. What do we have?
Well, we have artifacts that Amos would have been very familiar with, very at home with. In his time, it was the fashion to imitate the Phoenician style of pottery, this bright red finished, very shiny. We call it a burnish. This is a bowl. It's not well preserved, but it originally had this fine red finish, which is the style from Samaria.
So would that be relatively elitist? Would that be?
It would be.
So we're not talking about the poor.
No.
That Amos is concerned about, but maybe something in Amos's house.
Right. So we have the stratification going on between the rich and the poor, and the wealthy would be very visible at this point in history, and they would have set their tables with very fine ware.
And from Samaria, a city that comes up for some strong condemnation.
It does.
Especially with
sort of the center of this elite
very much so.
Show of wealth.
Yeah, so we'll see that. What else do we have?
We have bowls. You'd eat it with a bowl like this, a typical lamp from the time period. Some more interesting fine dining or probably feasting sorts of ware here. Something perhaps, we can only speculate. It's hard to tell, but probably something here to eat and then dip in the center. It's very probable. And then again, vessels that would have liquids in them, perhaps finer liquids here. This one is strainers, so we think that they use some sort of fermented drink that would be strained out and poured through.
Strain out the mash or the dregs or something like that. And then we have some weights over here on the little black box here. Kent, these are standard weights?
They are shekel weights.
They are shekel weights?
Yeah.
So tell us about them.
The little one there would be 1 shekel. It's about half an ounce. The next one is twice that, so 2 shekels are about 1 ounce. And then the largest one would be 4 shekels. And these weights would be implemented, placed on balanced beams, and then you would weigh out, the merchant would weigh out the right amount of spices or herbs or whatever. And it was very important to have a standardized, a fair weight. If you shave a little bit off your weight, then you're not, or you have poor weights, inaccurate weights.
Well, Amos
it's a way of cheating.
Amos comes fairly unglued when he's watching merchants in the gate and other places where exchanges are taking place. They are shaving off. They're using false balances, and they're using spoiled grain. So they capture, this is the class, the elite class, and the poor, who already can't afford the better grain, are getting a bum deal. They're getting bad grain, and they're getting less of it.
You think, there's nowhere to turn. I think that's the problem. There's no law that is enforced that will level the playing field, and that's part of the tragedy. One wishes for a fair judge if you have a case that goes to trial. And Amos is pointing out the fact that the scales are tipped socially, not just literally.
Right. And then a tablet. Say something about our tablet.
Well, we have a lot of texts that illustrate various aspects. The feasting, aspects of elite activity, the display of wealth, parallels that match very nicely what Amos is describing in Samaria and among the rich in the land.
Right. We will think about these. We want to keep these in mind as we turn our attention to some other images. I'm thinking about the bowl here, with probably used maybe for dipping.
Ritual.
That may have something to do with feasting, and perhaps even the Marseille feast.
We'll come to that one.
We are going to come to that. It's an important one. So then let's take some time to look at the book itself. The outline of the book, it doesn't take a lot to outline this book, although poetry, as we've discussed before, is not easy to outline. But this book, much more so than the one we dealt with in the last edition or the episode, like the Song of Songs. So there are some breaks here, and the types of speeches. Scholars who study forms, literary forms, can pick out several of them. Amos was a master, an absolute master at utilizing the literary forms available to him at his time. He was not only a master at utilizing this whole repertoire of literary forms, the woe speeches, we'll see some, the announcements of doom, the visions of destruction. They're pretty much negative. In fact, I remember the name in German of a book about Amos, Das Nein des Amos, the No of Amos, because it really does seem to be a negative. But Amos does so well at saying no. He's such a creative wordsmith. And not only that, but he takes interesting and positive ideas like the Exodus. I mean, who could fault the Exodus? The Exodus, we're delivered. He takes that and turns it against them.
He does.
He takes a sermon and turns it against them. So, Amos, I think you love him or you hate him. I think he's just as creative as can be. And when you look at all of the prophetic books, I'll have to say that Amos is right up there in terms of the quality and the impact and the commitment to the well-being of fellow human beings. I'm not sure there's much better. Okay, we might test that hypothesis as we go along. Now, there is a little note of restoration at the end, and you'll notice it's divided very carefully, not just by verse, but by half of a verse. And there is a definite shift there, and some people would even argue that that might have come along by a scribe, maybe in Amos's school, but adds a little bit of a positive note at the end of what seems to be fairly negative. And Amos is just saying, look, you treat people this way, you have created your own judgment, and this is, we've come to the end. We've come to the end of divine patience. So it's pretty powerful, pretty significant. Marzea. Talk to us, Kent, about Marzea feasts.
Well, the Marzeach is known for, well, over 3 millennia. And in the Bible, when translators first came to this Hebrew word, they did not understand it. But then other references started turning up. Up north at Ebla in the 3rd millennium BC, at Amar, at Ugarit, some of our best texts describing a Marzeach feast come from Ugarit. On down really into the into the Christian era. There are still references at Petra in the Byzantine text to Marzeach. So what was it? It seems to have been a feasting ritual, and there's reference to actually ownership of livestock and real estate by Marzeach sort of group, but there were Marzeach houses. So this was a real institution, and the wealthy would go probably again to consolidate alliances, and as part of this stature, if you could attend one of these Marzeachs. And they probably occur in different contexts as well, but no, broadly speaking.
The first one, the text that we're going to look at, puts this not at the human level, but at the divine.
Well, it does. So as the gods in the Canaanite pantheon imitate human activity, so there was a divine Marzeach.
And so we'll actually read that. We'll read at least part of it. So other kinds of things that we want to think about to which archaeology can contribute. Kind of general history of the time period of the 8th century. The Assyrian Empire, we'll see a map in a bit, not of the whole empire, but at least we'll see where it is. Fairly significant across Mesopotamia and into the Mediterranean. Social justice, fairness, we've talked about that. Archaeological evidence for the problems that farmers, agriculturalists faced, like pests and diseases, discomforts, disaster. We have lots of archaeological evidence to show the downside of life in antiquity. Archaeologists tend to be drawn to disasters because they tend to leave layers that are distinct.
Right.
But this means people died, people suffered, people burned. And so we probably ought to be a bit more reverent as we approach these things. But let's look at this Marzea text. This one set in the heavenly realms.
It is. So it comes from Ugarit, the coastal area of Syria. El slaughtered game in his house, beasts in the midst of his palace. He invited the gods to the carving. Eat, O gods, and drink. Drink wine to satiety, new wine to drunkenness. El sat. He assembled his drinking feast. El sat in his Marzeach. El drank wine to satiety, new wine to drunkenness.
So there's the word.
It is. There it is.
Is this the earliest use of the term?
It's not the earliest. We go back into the 1,000 years before that, roughly.
Okay.
But in this one, El actually gets so drunk, the high god gets drunk, he falls on the floor and he's in a stupor.
Yes.
It's quite shocking if one imagines describing one's own gods in such a human...
The high god.
The high god.
The high god that lives on the top of the mountain of the north, Mount Zaphon.
Mount Zaphon.
And it's actually even worse than you've described. You've been gentle.
Well, I have.
Because the language is language of excrement. It is language of slipping and sliding and falling. It's disastrous. But it's the deity enjoying a Marzea.
Yep.
I don't know if all human ones were supposed to be like that, but anyway. Okay, now the parallel. Let me read this one from Amos 6. Alas, for those who lie on beds of ivory. We'll come back to that one. And probably in Samaria, we need to be thinking about.
Right.
And lounge on their couches and eat lambs from the flock. Lambs, not full-grown sheep, but lambs. That suggests excess of wealth. People would not go for the lambs. They won't go for veal. They will go for the adult ones when they have their festivals. Calves from the stall, who sing idle songs to the sound of the harp, and like David, improvise on instruments of music. These people are being condemned for this. And I think in part, it's not because all of these activities are problematic. It's that these are problematic because they're being enjoyed at the expense of the poor.
Right.
On the backs of the poor.
Right.
Who drink wine from bowls, which is an interesting image, anoint themselves with the finest oils. We read that elsewhere, and it's a great thing to anoint with fine oil. But here, it is built on oppression, but are not grieved over the ruin of Joseph. Therefore, now we get to the Marseille text. Therefore, they shall now be the first to go into exile, and the revelry is the word that comes out of the Marseille. The revelry of the loungers shall pass away. So, Amos may not be saying it's a bad idea to have a Marseille, but when it's at the expense of the poor, this is going to cost you.
In the context that he's witnessing,
yes.
In society at large, it's become a problem.
Okay, another image. This is from a cup, I think.
It is, again, from Ugarit, where that text came from, about the divine Marseille. You can see there a picture of El, the high god, sitting and enjoying his feast.
And this is typically how El is pictured?
Seated, yes, yes. And there is the Ugaritic tablet.
That has the description on it. Yep. So several artifacts. We've looked at some on the table, but we will look at others. Weights and measures, you've talked about those. Ivories, beds of ivory and ivories. So we're going to look at several of these that came from the capital city of Samaria. And I think you mentioned before, this is where the wealth is going to be concentrated.
Right.
So this is where people are going to be able to afford the elite goods and goods that are sent in. Again, at the expense of the poor. That's what Amos loses it over. It's the problem of walking and treading on the backs of the poor to get this wealth.
The mistreatment and unfair treatment of the poor.
Right, right. So we do have an Acropolis. It's an interesting place to visit. We won't spend too much time here. I wanted to look at the ivories. Talk to us about these.
Really, the Phoenicians are the ones that developed this form of art, but these are inlays. So think of furniture with these carvings of ivory inlaid in the arms and the backs. In Assyria, we actually see some depictions in wall relief showing the furniture with the carvings in them, so we have a pretty good idea how they function. Look at this, a fallow deer, the thick antlers. Just one of the scenes, one of the animals that would be illustrated. Looks like we have
probably a lion, some kind of feline, I suspect.
Yeah, grabbing the neck of, is that a boar?
Or maybe a cow, maybe a bovine of some kind. But in any case, capturing prey, right? I mean, with the tongue sticking out there, this is capture. This is a snapshot. This is almost like you'd think of a photo that captures the last moment.
Yeah.
That this particular creature.
Yeah, and the Sphinx or the cherub. So this is the picture of a cherub. So again, a lion-footed, winged creature with a human head.
And they are called cherubs or cherubim. Certainly Ezekiel describes them this way. And so maybe we have to keep thinking about the picture we have of humans. There are actually some ancient descriptions that do have humans too. So I don't know that one can press the argument too much one way or the other. But in any case, this seems to be the more popular.
Right.
And these critters, these creatures, tend to be around deity or royalty. Is it a guarding function?
I think so. There's sort of a guardian presence that would indicate, again, sort of the divine presence. The kings would sort of blend into that.
Right, right, okay. One of the most beautiful.
It is. Another ivory here showing the recessed or rabbit-tipped window with a nice balustrade in front and then a woman looking through. And we don't know all of the social implications here, but it's a popular theme. References seem to imply this in some of the poetry in the Bible, and we have the ivories, we've got other references. So it was a very popular theme in art.
In Morocco, I recall visiting in Marrakesh, the architecture has these privacy windows for women. I'm not sure how much anybody is relating these to, or how much we should, but in any case, these are just spectacular. They are beautiful, they are aesthetically appealing, and they draw us to them, and there are several of them. Inscriptions, we have several here, and they connect, as we can see in this slide, with different parts of Amos. We may not get through all of them, but we do want to look at some. So we have the Tiglath-Pileser, the first, with Amos 1, Caret with Amos 2, Amos 5, it gets a couple, and then some other letters too. So we'll try. We'll get through some of these. Okay, Kent, help us out with this one.
To Zimri-Lim, king of Mari. So Mari is over near the Euphrates. From Nur-Sin, official of Mari. An Apilum prophet of Adu told me, I am Adu, your divine patron. Have I ever asked too much of you? Hear the cry of your people when they suffer injustice. Do what I ask and what I have written. Obey my word. Protect the land. Defend the state.
Addressed to the king. The Mari prophets, that was one of their major functions, is addressing the king. And here for reasons of social justice. Tiglath-Pileser the first.
The first. So early part of the Iron Age, around 1100, one of the first Assyrian kings to push past the Euphrates back into Syria.
We don't have quite the reliefs, nor the texts from this Tiglath.
He's quite early in the Iron Age.
He is. So after the hunter consulted the prophets, interesting, we've got the prophets here, he hitched his horses to his chariots as fast as Adad the storm and Shamash the sun. He set out before the sun rose. He marched 3 days' distance before dawn. The hunter cut open the wombs of the pregnant. He blinded infants. We're going to read about the Ammonites in Amos who cut open women with child. So we've got this problem. I mean, this is brutal, truly brutal. And it's part of the ancient world. Caret, Ken.
Yasub indicts Caret. Your illness made you derelict. You did not hear the case of the widow. You did not hear the case of the poor. You did not sentence the oppressor. You did not feed the orphan in the city. You did not feed the widow in the country.
So again, not taking care of the poor. This is actually from another context entirely, but it's from a stone, and I am going to back up this to what we have from Gezer, from the town of Gezer.
Very early inscription.
What, 10th century, something like that.
Right.
And this is a listing of different agricultural seasons, which do matter. We've run. I think our technology here has gone astray just a bit. But that particular one talks about the summer fruit. Amos in Amos 7, you are like summer fruit, and you're rotting, and it's too late to save you. Nobody wants to eat you now. You're gone. That's part of the negativity, and so we have that even in this text. We have some other texts that deal with. One of them deals with the issue of borrowing a garment. What's happening there?
Well, a wealthy person is taken in a garment from a person who basically is a surety of a loan, and the question then, like in the Bible, what do you do when someone takes a garment? You should give it back to the person so that they can have.
And that's before
life.
The sun goes down.
Before the sun goes down.
Because you needed the warmth and so on. Amos talks about that in chapter 2, and one of our texts talks about the very same thing. One of our texts talks about the golden rule, basically.
It does.
Do unto others like you would have others do unto you. One of them talks about seeking justice and living. It's a lot like Amos. Thank you, Kent, and thank all of you for joining us for this edition of Excavating the Bible. We hope this program has been helpful to you. We look forward to next time. Until then, think ancient, keep believing, and keep exploring. For Excavating the Bible, I'm Doug Clark.